Hi everyone. Today we receive Dr. Sophie, and she will talk about women in science. So first step we'll learn about Sophie and your profession area and your formation. And Sophie by Sophie. So, Sophie, the first question I would like to ask about what is your formation? Where are you formation? Where
Okay,
are you studied?
sure. Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here, and I hope you can understand me clearly. I'll try to speak slowly. I began in this particular area after I finished my master's degree. I began work with an international think tank which looked at international policy and science issues relating to the environment. And this was my first real professional activity. And at that time, they were looking at climate change and carbon emission issues and trade issues, but they weren't looking at gender. So we started a program that looked at gender and science policy in the developing world in relation to some technology issues which we thought were important for women. And in those days, this was in the early 90s, we chose energy issues around cook stoves and other energy challenges, trade and economics, and women's representation in science. And so I worked with that program for a few years, and then I went to do my PhD. I went to York University in Toronto, where I looked at international policy issues around development challenges. I looked also with a focus on gender and development, but also a focus on the international science, international policy realm related to science, environment, gender, and other development challenges. So I'm a social scientist, but my interest is very much in the gender dimensions of science and technology as they address development challenges. So my background is quite international and in a range of issues. When I finished my PhD, I began work with women in global science and technology, so that's been quite a long time now, and also began to work with we worked with international NGOs around these issues. We worked with an advocacy coalition for the UNESCO World Conference on Science in 1999. We wanted to promote the participation of women in the conference, and we were responsible for paragraph 90, which we were very proud of, because it was the first time that the international organizations such as UNESCO, UNCTAD, the international governments, really put gender on the science agenda in the global context. They called for more work on supporting women in science at all levels of education and the workforce. It called for collection of sex disaggregated data, which is something very important to me, and it called for promoting the role of women in science around the world. And so that was in 1999, and since then I've been working with a number of different United Nations organizations, NGOs, and other groups to promote these issues in different contexts. So I am not directly affiliated with the university, but I do a lot of work around research with different universities, organizations, UN agencies, and so forth. And so it's been a very interesting career path, and one that's not a usual career path, but this is where it has led me. And so now I look very at these issues in the global context, but now I'm focusing very strongly on what kind of sex disaggregated data exists in these issues, and how do we know the participation of women in science and technology, and what kind of data exists around their use of science and technology and their ability to participate in innovation in the economy, and to improve their incomes, to improve their situation in life. And I do focus on women very strongly, but we also try to look at how these things affect men as well. And, you know, of course, when you look at gender, you need to look at other issues. You look at socioeconomic level, you look at geographic location, you look at ethnicity, you look at access to education or level of education. And so while we can't do that with data, that data is not collected in such great detail. We do try to take into account all of these issues when we're doing our analysis. And some of the countries that we have been looking at closely do address these issues in different ways, and it's interesting to see the different approaches as well that are taken in different parts of the world.
Sophie, what was your motivation to start in this area?
That's a very good question. In some way, it was planned, and in some ways, it wasn't planned. And there was a personal element. You know, I grew up in a very conservative religious community, and so it was part of my rebellion against what I was told a woman had to be. And it was also the part of the people I met, and both professionally and personally, who I saw were leaders in this, and who made made this kind of work seem really exciting and engaging. And I was lucky to be with a group of people who do this work at the international level, so I could see and compare the situation around the world, and that made it even much more interesting for me. So it's the combination of the international perspective as well as the understanding of male and female relations, that the combination was very interesting to me.
So, do you think that this area should be encouraged from the school area?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. Do you think that this area should be encouraged from the school area?
Yes, definitely I do. You know, there's the saying that science and technology are gender neutral. And there's no gender in the laboratory. But we're all starting to understand that it's not, perhaps when you're dissecting a cell, you're not thinking about gender issues. But on the other hand, even then you're thinking about gender issues, aren't you? Is it a male or female? Is it part of, you know, to what purposes are you using this? How is the research question developed? Who sets the agenda? I had this discussion really just yesterday when I was talking with some agricultural scientists. And they said to me, you know, what is the gender issue for plant breeding? There's no gender issues. And I said, well, yes, of course there's gender issues. You know, there are female farmers or female members of households have different use for seeds and for plants than men do. And who decides which kind of seeds will be developed, and who makes the decisions around the characteristics of the seeds? Women and men, for example, in Africa often have different uses for different grains, and will desire that they have different traits or different characteristics. So, for example, an example in the 90s is about cassava. There was a new cassava variety developed, but the developers worked, or the scientists worked only with the men and asked them what they were looking for, and so they developed a cassava that would be more attractive for the urban markets. But the women were not happy with the new variety of cassava because they used it at home. They prepared it as part of the meals for the family. They found that the taste was different. They found that it didn't last as long. It didn't store as well. And the old cassava had a slight amount of toxin in it, which kept the pests away. But when this toxin was no longer there in the same quantities, then there was more of a pest problem in the storage of the grain. And so that's one example of how science itself, the method, you can say it isn't gendered, although many people will argue with you on that. But for sure, the social, the life, the economic, the political issues around it are gendered. And women as well as men should have equal say in how science is used and to what ends it's expanded, and technology as well. And so I certainly feel that these issues should be much more highlighted in countries. There should be an understanding that for now, men have been much more predominant in science and technology, and much of science and technology, than women. And so that is why I've been so interested in collecting the data on this, on participation of women and participation of men. And we're finding out that, yes, there are many, many women in biosciences, in the biological sciences and the health sciences, but very few women in the other sciences. For example, in computing and information technology, there's very few men. And so there's we all know, we've heard of the very male-dominant male environment that can, not always, but that can persist in information technology workforces. And perhaps in Brazil you've heard of Gamergate. This is the oppression of a female video gamer in the US who's been violently attacked online and threatened with death and rape and all sorts of things because she has criticized some aspects of the way that video games are developed and some aspects of the gender roles in video games. And so this sort of thing is still a very real part of how science and technology are lived out today in all countries of the world. And so I think it's very much time for all of us to be much more aware that these issues exist, and to begin to think how they apply to all of us. And I've seen over and over again, when these issues are raised and people become more aware of these issues, then there are changes. And there's when there's better communication among people about these issues, between women and men, and people become more aware of how they're interacting with science and technology, then changes do take place, positive changes.
So, do you think there is any problem about stereotypes for girls to enter in the area of science?
Yes, very much, very much. And there are differences in different countries. For example, in Indonesia, it's very desirable for a young woman to be an information technology specialist. But that's very unusual. In North America, an information technology person has a reputation of being very unsocial, of staying inside all day and never going outside, of not being interested in anything except computers. And those sorts of stereotypes are very unattractive for young girls, for young women. But the other side of the stereotype is that when people think of a scientist or a technologist, they think of a man. They often think of a white man, but they think of a man. And these, and even here when we have commercials, for example, women's hand lotion, often they will put a white man in a lab coat on TV, you know, holding the hand lotion and saying, we have tested this hand lotion and we've determined it's very good for women's skin. And so there's still so many preconceptions about that. The other preconception is that science and technology are not fun. They're boring, you wear boring clothes, you stay inside all the time, you don't work with interesting people. I think in the tech sector that's really changing. I think it's becoming more and more cool and hip to be in the tech sector, but it's still very much perceived of as a male area, a male domain. And some companies like Google and Microsoft are trying very hard to bring more women into the workforce, as well as a more diverse ethnic workforce. But it's a struggle because girls and women are very turned off by some of these stereotypes and feel that they don't want to be tagged or labeled as someone who is in that world. So there needs to be work done about, I like very much the idea of these hangouts, to have real people talk about what they're doing. Young girls and young women need to be able to see more role models, more real women doing interesting work in these areas, who are attractive, able to dress properly, fashionably, who are socially comfortable. They need those role models to see, and they also need to see that there are many interesting things they can do with science. Girls and women are not interested in science often because they think it's too limited and it's too narrow. But many studies have been done that show that when science and technology is presented to girls and women in a broader context of, say, environmental issues or fashion design even, or how it applies to people's lives, then they're much more interested. And that's my feeling as to why there are so many women and girls in the health sciences, in the medical sciences, and the biological sciences, because they can see how it applies to help people's lives. And so if some of the other sciences could do a better job of showing how they can positively have an impact on people's lives, I think more girls and women would be interested.
So there is already some change in the context of women in science on the world.
I'm sorry, what is the question that you're asking?
There is already some change in the context of women in science, global science.
Yes, there are some changes. There are some positive changes, but there are also some negative changes. In the data project that we've been undertaking, we have compared the situation of women in the science and technology education and workforce in 6 countries: in Brazil, in India, Indonesia, South Africa, South Korea, and the US. And surprisingly, what we found is that actually there has been a decrease of women in the science and technology workforce overall since about 2007, 2008. And in some sectors an even greater decrease and earlier. And so part of that is, I think, that just the decrease in jobs in general because of the economic downturn. But there are concerns as well that some of this is because women and girls are actually finding it more and more difficult to make it in the workforce and are dropping out. The other interesting piece of data that we found is that while there, in some sectors of science, there's quite a healthy percentage of young women entering sciences in university, by the time you get to the workforce, to the professional life and jobs, the percentage, the numbers of women and women in the field has dropped by at least 15%, and in some cases almost half have just dropped out of science entirely. And so while there are some very good, there are more and more young women in some countries entering science. In many countries, they are dropping out. Now, I should say Brazil is a little bit of an exception. Brazil has a very good record of supporting women in science in not all disciplines. I've just been speaking with some people in neuroscience in Brazil. There's a very high number of young women in the sciences, but there is still the case in Brazil, as there is in other countries, that as you move higher up, for awards, for fellowships, for professorships, for very senior positions, for leadership, then you have fewer and fewer women. And so that is still the challenge. Part of that is because women fall behind because they have families and they lose time when they have children. and they have trouble catching up, and sometimes they drop out entirely. And in some sectors, it's because they find the workforce, the work environment to be very unfriendly. And in the U.S., for example, we're hearing lots of stories of how the information technology sector is very unfriendly for women. There's a lot of harassment, there's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of higher expectations for women than men, and so forth. In Brazil, I don't know exactly what the situation is. I have a suspicion that it's a mixture of having, family responsibilities and perhaps not having the same access to the professional networks. One of the issues for many women in the developing world is that they do not have the same access to travel. They're not able to travel as easily for field research or for conferences, either because they don't have the same access to funding or because they have family responsibilities. And that can really affect your chances for promotion, for advancement. And so there's a number of factors all along the way that combine to decrease the number of women. But I do think that in the younger ages, in high school and university, in many countries there are improvements. And certainly with Brazil supporting science and technology the way it does and supporting people in education in that sector, that's a really strong positive factor to bring more women in. The challenge then will be to make sure that they stay in all the way up to the top. But again, Brazil's record on this is better in some ways than other countries, although there's still more room for improvement.
What do you think that we can do to motivate the girls to come to study in science and enter to science world?
Yeah. There are a few things that can be done. We're increasingly becoming aware that good teaching involves paying attention and working with both girls and boys, and good teaching really makes both girls and boys very enthusiastic. And so there are teaching methods in primary schools and in secondary schools that can really engage and make both girls and boys enthusiastic about science. And so once you start that, then girls are also very interested in science, and we find that more of them go on in science. So that's one thing to do, and to make it active and hands-on. There's a science curriculum called inquiry-based science education. That's a very practical, hands-on approach to science education, which has had some real success. And it's good for girls as well as for boys. So that's one very simple thing. I think the role of parents in this as well is very important, to encourage both their girls and their boys to continue in education, to continue in technology or science courses, and to not kind of channel them in one direction or the other. And it's also very important to support young girls and young women as they move on in their life, and not force them either. In many countries, part of the problem is early marriage, and girls who get married younger drop out of the workforce. So to encourage them in their aspirations and their goals, and to ensure that they have a way of getting support to deal with family responsibilities if they have children, or their housework, or the need to cook dinner. All of that will ensure that they're much more able to continue. And as I said earlier, to help, in particular, young women understand that science and technology are relevant for so many different things, and there's so many exciting and interesting things that can be done in science and technology. That is one sure way of generating their enthusiasm. In Argentina, the Ministry of Science and Technology has initiated something called Technopolis TV, which you may know of. And what I like very much about Technopolis TV is that it has real people talking in a very relaxed and casual and engaging manner about what they do, making it very interesting and very exciting. And they also have many women speaking about their work as well as men. And so things like that I think are really, really helpful and very encouraging for young women and men when they're thinking about these things.
Do you know any problem about discrimination happening to women in world science that you work?
Yes, I can give you a Canadian example. There was a very eminent woman physicist who's now at Harvard University. She'd won national prizes. She had published huge amount, she'd published a lot of articles, and yet she was told when she was at the University of Toronto that she was skipped over for a promotion because she wasn't good enough. She wasn't as good as everyone else. And so part of the problem was that she was a very outspoken woman, and she was not afraid to speak her mind. And sometimes, and that was used against her. She was considered to be argumentative and aggressive, and not a productive member of the faculty. So eventually she left and she went to Harvard, and now she's at Harvard University, and she's hugely respected, and she's very eminent, and she's probably more eminent than the people who didn't want to promote her in Toronto. And there's many examples of women in different science departments who will be passed over for tenure or passed over for a promotion, even if they've published extensively. Just because their work is not considered to be good enough, or they don't look like a scientist that many people expect. There have been studies that have shown that works by men, if a man's name is on an article, it's ranked more highly than if a woman's name is on the article. So a study was done which took the same article and sent it to people with a man's name on it, sent it to a group of people with a woman's name on it, and sent it to a group of people with just an initial. And when it had the man's name on it, it ranked the highest. When it had the initial, it ranked second, and when it had the female's name on it, it ranked third. And so these are just what's called, inherent bias. That people have gut reactions that they don't always pay attention to, and so it's very, it still remains for us to understand that science doesn't have the male face. It has different faces, and there may be different ways of projecting science. There may be different ways of working within science, but these ways all, really need to be respected as well.
Yeah. The pregnancy is still a major problem for the women who work with research.
Yes, in many parts of the world it is. I'm not sure how it is in Brazil, but in many parts of the world. Well, in the science system is set up really, as they say, for men. It was set up in the 19th century when it was only men who worked outside of the house. They all had a wife who stayed home and cooked dinner for them and washed their clothes and made sure they had, a good sleep, and then sent them back in the morning. And so all of their needs were taken care of. The only thing they needed to be concerned about was their work. But now we're provided them with children, and then they'd see the children in the evenings when they came home, and they could work a certain number of hours every day without interruption. But now that science has women included as well, who suddenly all of these other issues are part of the equation. And if women are required to continue to provide all the needs of their families, as well as publish equally with men, it's impossible. They can't work the same level of performance if they have to go home and cook supper, or if they have to take care of the children, or if they have to take the children to school before going to work, or if they have to stay home for 2 years to take care of a baby. And yet the science system doesn't give women any credit for that. And so if a woman stays home to have children, whether or not there's maternity leave in the, in government policy or not, she is still 2 years behind her male colleague who graduated in the same year if he doesn't take paternity leave. And so they become penalized for who they are and the role they play. And so what needs to happen is that there needs to be an understanding that both men and women may have to make allowances for their family and personal life, but also that women shouldn't be penalized, for example, during tenure or performance reviews for perhaps not publishing as many articles because for 2 or 3 years she stayed home with the children. And so there needs to be another way of assessing people's ability and performance in science that doesn't penalize the fact that women are caring for their families as well as having a career in science. And of course the other argument will be then, well, why don't we just let women stay home and have children? They don't need to be scientists. But the argument is also made, and I would make this argument, that science would then suffer as a result. Science would lose the contributions and the talents of half of the population, half of the potential scientific research population, and that, that drops its capabilities and cuts it by 50%. So this issue is still not really well resolved for women in science. I think in some of the other professions there is more ability for women to work at home. If you don't have to go to a laboratory, if you don't have to use scientific equipment, if you're writing a paper or reading a book, if you're doing that kind of work, you can do it at home. And so women in the social sciences are not as penalized. But the fact that they need to be in a certain place for science makes it very difficult, and for university teaching. More and more, I think that men are taking on some of that responsibility, and more countries and universities are instituting paternity leave, or leave for men as well as leave for women to take care of young children. And I think that's something that if that burden was borne equally by the husband and the wife, then they too should be recognized for that and not penalized in their professional life for that. So, but that is one of the biggest challenges, I think, globally. Yeah, around the world. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
So the largest position remain mostly among men?
Sorry, the longer... Can you repeat that? Sorry?
Yes. The largest position remain mostly among with the men's?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you agree with it? Can you talk about anything about this?
Yeah, it's true in many professions and in much of the world. The work that we've been doing, and that is that there are more men at the top, and they take fewer breaks from their careers. They stay in one career. Well, they stay in their work life consistently and without breaks, and they progress at a faster rate and advance into higher positions more than women do. And that's true in most professions, I think. What we found in our review was we looked at a number of different parts of social, economic, and educational and scientific life to see how men and women compared. And what we found, across the board was that there are still more men in Parliament, more men in the decision-making in the life of a country, more male ministers, government ministers. Men make up the majority of senior level managers in the private sector and on corporate boards. They make up the majority of of people in the science academies of each country. So yes, this is still a real issue, and people say, well, there are more women now coming into science, and so it's just a matter of time before those numbers move up and women are equal with men. Well, they've been saying that for 20 or 30 years now, and that's still not the case. In Brazil, there has been a lot of improvement, and when I was in Brazil, there was that very interesting presentation by our colleague from the Ministry of, from the university, I'm sorry, I forget her name, who was showing how there is increase in women's access to grant funding and advancement in the university, but it's still not at parity, it's still not equal with men, and Brazil is quite unusual in the success that women have in this area. And so this is something where there are some very slow inroads made in some countries, but in many countries it's still the case where there's very, very low participation. South Korea is one example of a country that in some ways has a lot of very good policy. It's considered a rich country. It has a very highly advanced science and technology structure and system, and yet women are very represented in a very minor way. They make up 12% of engineers in the country, no, 11% of engineers in the country, and 30% of scientists. So if you include science and engineering, they're less than 20% in the country. And this is a country where there's universal education, high-level education. Women are have very good access to all levels of education, and yet they are not going into science and they are not going into the workforce. South Korea is a country where they have the lowest percentage of women in the private sector in management positions of all the developed countries. 1% of women on corporate boards and less than 20% of women in senior management. And so, you know, there are still these blocks in the system, blocks in progress for women. And what we're finding out is that it's not enough just to say there are going to be more women in the system. We're going to have more women entering education, more women entering science education, because that doesn't seem to be sufficient. We're finding out in many countries, and the US is another country, where women are still barely represented in engineering and the computer than 20%. And this has been going, you know, they have been trying to bring women in for years and years and years. And so there are other issues that are blocking the advancement of women. And one of the things that we've been doing with our research at Women in Global Science and Technology is to try to look at what are some of these larger issues. You know, there are issues in the workforce, which we've been discussing, but there are issues around cultural attitudes of what is appropriate for women to be doing, for women to be doing. In some countries, it's much, much stronger and more of a barrier than in other countries. And in many countries in the world, it's still considered natural for men to continue in this, but it's quite unusual if women decide to continue. And so these are some of the issues people are dealing with in different parts of the world.
So, leveraging this topic, can you talk anything about, or I don't know if you know anything about this, Matilda effect?
No, I'm not familiar with it, so I'm sorry. I can't. I could look it up on Google quickly. Let you know.
No problem. So, do you know anything about why we have more women in the health science than physics or astronomy science?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, you know, there are lots of theories about this, and we're not really clear, but I think, you know, there's been a much I think for women, the health sciences were the easiest because it's closest to the traditional role for women. Women are seen to be caregivers and to take care of their family members, to take care of family members when they're sick, to be there to try and make people healthy and support their, support people in their lives. And so I think it was the first place of transition into the workforce. It's kind of natural that it would be in the health sciences. Before Florence Nightingale, if you remember, I don't know if you know Florence Nightingale, who was a famous nurse in England in the 19th century or the 18th century. Before she was around, being a nurse was a very unrespected profession. And women who were nurses, it's kind of like the old doctors many years ago were not very well respected. But people like Florence Nightingale and others became role models for other women and made it an acceptable profession for women. And so I think with the beginning of nursing and so forth, women gradually began to come into those professions in more numbers. And I think also, women and girls are very interested in the relations between people and interactions between people and connecting with people. So the interest in biology and medical sciences, I think, is related to an interest in how people are in the world and helping people in the world make the world a better place. I think, for example, in engineering, in Canada and the US, environmental engineering has one of the highest percentages of females in it. And I think that's because women can see a way of using engineering to improve the world, to work in the world, and to do something concrete in the world. I think things like computer engineering and electrical engineering are more challenging for women to understand what contribution they would like to make to that. There's comments made that men and boys like to go inside a machine and figure out the tiny little connections in the machine and how it works and what makes it work, and women and girls are much more interested in what the machine can do in the world. And that's a little bit of a stereotype, but that's been one way that people have looked at the differences for women and girls and men and boys in this. You do find, for example, that even in the IT sector, there's the largest numbers of women are in training, technical support, work with people, the more softer sides of the technology, and fewer are in the real, very high-tech, hard-tech kind of aspects. Now, whether that's because men and women are channeled in different ways by teachers and bosses and parents, or whether that's an innate interest is something I am not qualified to speak on. But I think a lot of it does have to do with how Professor Volchan had some very interesting comments on that in the seminar last month, that there are these inherent gender attitudes that start at a very young age and are very difficult to change.
So sometimes I listen the one phrase, this kind of common sense, this humans are not good for exact science. What do you think about this? Do you agree or disagree about this?
You may have a point, isn't it? You may very well have a point. So computers should be doing the exact sciences. Is that what you're saying? I think you're right in saying that humans definitely have many other influences on them, don't they? They have social influences and physiological influences. If you're hungry, you're thinking one thing, and if you've eaten a good meal, you're thinking in a different way, aren't you? So yeah, I think you're right about that. And if you take gender into account as well, then there's just a whole range of other factors influencing you. It's very complex.
So in Canada, it's very different to Brazil. about women science or the same
No, the
situation?
numbers, well, some of the trends are similar, but I would say that the participation is slightly lower in Canada of women. We do have, more women in the health sciences and the biological sciences, and we probably have more than 50% women in the medical sciences as doctors and nurses. But very, very few women in engineering, and I think Brazil is ahead of us in that respect. We have something like 15% women in engineering, and Brazil has slightly higher figures than that. We also don't have as many women who are working in technical professions, and such as information technician or biotechnical technician, biotechnical professional. Brazil has many more people in those professions than Canada does. The other interesting thing is that Brazil has a much stronger policy of promoting science and technology and education in general, and has a stronger gender aspect to that than Canada. And Canada has not been actively promoting science and technology to the same extent until very recently. Even so, it's very slow. And the United States has been much more active than Canada in this area. And that's something that Canada really does need to change.
So near to finish this hangout, I will pass to take the same question to spectator. And
yes, I'm happy to. Yeah.
And the first question is about Janisa Vasquez, and she asked about there are now many professionals in other fields than the scientific. Professionals who can combine great family responsibilities, and do believe it would be harder in science because have any connection with culture. Professor?
Sorry. So the question is, I'm sorry. What is the question? Is there any connection with what is the reason that it's more? Is that the question? What is the reason that it's more difficult in science?
If have any problem with custom.
Yeah, no, it's not clear exactly what the question is, but it is true that my thinking is that it is more difficult in science than in many other professions to combine your family life and other aspects of your life with your job. Partly because of the requirement to work with very expensive machinery and equipment that is located in the university, so that so that you cannot work at home as easily. If you're in computer science or information technology, there's this sense that you have to work all night. If you're a good programmer, you work all night, and if you go home at a normal time, you're not a good programmer, you're not a good computer technician. And so these attitudes in the science make it much more difficult for women to be able to have flexible time, to be able to structure their time and maybe go home and take care of the kids and then work in the evenings, or start a little late or start a little early. All of these things make it a little bit more, there's a little less flexibility for women. The other thing that is talked about a lot is as well that science is still a little bit of a macho culture. And the information technology world is definitely still a macho culture. And that just makes it more difficult for women to break in as well. They're not always part of the professional networks in some countries in the world, you know, they're not allowed to talk to men out who they're not related to. And so if you're in a professional situation, to not be able to have a really good connection with your colleagues will make it much more difficult for you to move forward. And that's true in science as in other areas. And then the third issue I think that makes science more difficult for women is the issue of tenure and professional advancement in the university, where you are penalized and made to fall behind because you have to stay home and have children, and you have to take a break from work, and it means you have fewer publications, and you've taught fewer classes. And while this may also be true to a certain extent in the social sciences, you do have more opportunity to catch up in the social sciences at home or without having to show up at the university, and I think probably just because there are more women in the social sciences, it's more acceptable and it's less of a barrier, and you're not accused of not taking your work seriously if you have family responsibilities. I'm finding in Canada and in Europe that it's becoming much more acceptable for men to take time off to take care of their children. And I think from work, and I think that's a really good, change, a positive development, that it becomes acceptable for both men and women to do that, and not be considered to be shirking or lazy or not fulfilling their professional responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that she have any relationship with customs in?
I'm sorry?
Do you believe some problems with the woman science to work and have any relationship with the customs?
Yes, that as well. And in many countries, you know, in parts of Africa, it's considered that women don't have the capacity to understand science and technology in some regions of the world. And, you know, I say Africa just because there have been some studies on that, but I would say in all parts of the world there will always be people who think that women are not as smart as men, right? Are not as capable, are not able to manage equipment, right? They're not able to manage technology. They don't have the same aptitude as men do. For example, I was just in Macedonia, and in Macedonia, the men drive the cars. The women, they only 25% of driver's license go to women, because it's the men who drive the cars in Macedonia. And so in many parts of the world, there's still this perception that technology and science are a male domain. They're what men do, and women do other things. And so for women to break into that field can be quite difficult as a result. They'll be having to prove themselves all the time, to prove that they're as good or better than the men to be accepted.
So we are nearly to end, and I would like to say thanks for everyone that follow us, and thank you so much for Sophie to talk with us today.
Yes, thank you.
Your time for talk about human science, and I would like to pass to you to say your ultimate words for spectators.
I'm sorry, to say some final words? Is that what you're asking?
If you can talk with some words for peoples.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to conclude by saying I think that the gender differences in science and technology, in the workforce, in how people decide to do science and technology and how they do it, are really a very interesting area, and they're an area of much potential, of positive potential. I think that there are many positive trends towards women and men both contributing in science and technology and opening up new areas of research and technology application that are very exciting, and that there's a lot of room to be positive and optimistic. There are still barriers, but we are learning more and more what those barriers are and what we can do about them. And, you know, the interest of people like you and people in Brazil and in other parts of the world in figuring out what these issues are and understanding them better, I think is a really positive sign of where we're going with this. And so thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
And so I just would like to say one thing. This video I will translate and put this version after maybe 1 or 2 weeks.
Okay.
And if anyone would like to see this video in Portuguese, I will give in YouTube or in our site. And in this Saturday we will have another hangout, but in Portuguese with Professor Eliel about science education in Brazil. So I will say in Portuguese for other people understand also. Então, sábado que vem, para todos que nos acompanharam, a gente vai estar com o professor Eliel falando sobre educação científica no Brasil. E esse vídeo vai estar com as legendas a partir daqui a 1 ou 2 semanas, para quem quiser assistir novamente, traduzido e com as legendas às quais a professora Sophia respondeu às nossas perguntas e também as minhas perguntas que eu fiz em inglês. Agradeço a todos mais uma vez, espero vê-los nesse sábado agora no Hangout com o professor Eliel. And Professor Sophia, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And I hope can see you again the next week, the next year, and another time.
Happy to.
Okay, thank you. Bye, Professor.
Thank you. Bye.